Number 25, Esther and Job, in the series The Picture of God in All 66 by Graham Maxwell. Recorded January 1984.
Well, next time the Psalms, and that's the whole hymn book, which is quite an order. Our purpose is to discern the picture of God in each of those psalms and prayers and hymns. Now, in order for the Psalms to speak of God, one really has to read them as a whole. They're not a collection of statements. If you begin collecting statements one by one, you'll run into Psalm 77:10, where the Revised Standard reads, "It is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed." How's that for a key text? Or in today's English version, "What hurts me most is this, that God is no longer powerful." That's the way he felt in the middle of the psalm, but you should read the rest of it, and the answer is given. So, as anywhere in the Bible, one should never read passages in isolation. I mentioned two different versions there. The versions vary in their translation of that verse, but since many of you are using different versions, you're going to run into translations that may seem to be a problem. Psalm 2:11 says, "God's wrath is quickly kindled," in the Good News Bible. Or, "His wrath can flare up in a moment," in the New International Version. I thought he was slow to wrath. Well, once again, one needs to read the whole psalm. Or take the vengeance psalms coming up. Remember during the quarterly, last quarter, we looked at those. For example, 58:10 has the psalmist looking forward to bathing his feet in the blood of his enemies. Have you ever prayed for that? Maybe we've gone soft in these last days. Is it all right to be so frank and so truthful in prayer? I mean, if you really hate somebody, you shouldn't mention it in prayer, should you? You should say, always, preserving your best saintly image when you're on your knees, "Lord, I love that man," even though he knows you hate him. Shouldn't one fib to God so he'll think well of you? Well, he knows our thoughts anyway, so why not tell him the truth? When the psalmist desired vengeance, he said so. And the matter of vengeance raises interesting problems in some of the messianic psalms, so-called. If you can't read them all, do note especially the 69th psalm. Verses 9, 21 to 28, it's clearly messianic. They gave me vinegar to drink and things like that. And yet you'll notice in 21 to 28, the psalmist is saying, don't forgive them. When Jesus was on the cross, he said, do forgive them. Note, it's just the opposite of what Jesus said, and yet that's regarded as a messianic psalm. It seems to me Jesus did much better on the cross than is described in this psalm. Is it the comparison that's significant? Jesus is the first one who ever behaved like that under such pressure. But we should look at those with care. Why so much reference to fighting? Could it be that the psalmist was a military man? Well, he was, wasn't he? Had he some other profession or way of life, he might have used different illustrations. He does say, "The Lord is my shepherd." He spent some time with the sheep too. And of course, the Psalms are not all by David, as you know. Of course, one will hardly avoid the 51st Psalm. After the sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, a most magnificent statement. But why would God record people's feelings under inspiration? Their feelings of depression, feelings of vengeance, along with a lot of good feelings. Why record other people's experiences for us? What can we learn about God from that? Well, that will be next time. Now this time, Esther, relatively briefly, because Job is so significant. We could spend 2 periods on Job or more. What can you learn about God from a book that never mentions God and nobody prays? Did any of you read, though, in the Good News Bible, today's English version? There is mention there of prayer, isn't there? Did anyone use the Living Bible to read Esther? Then God is mentioned, isn't he? Not in the Hebrew. Dr. Taylor put that in. And of course, God is there behind the scenes, clearly, all the time anyway. Just isn't mentioned. Now, everyone knows the story. What what does this romantic tale reveal to us about God? You remember Vashti refuses to come in and display her beauty before those men. They'd been indulging themselves for some time. She really was a heroine. She risked her life not coming in, but the book's not about her. So the king, though he has a large harem all the time, he's lost his number one wife. So there's a beauty contest. And one of the Jewish girls enters, even though if she wins, she will wind up in an Oriental potentate's harem, and he's a heathen. Would this be an adulterous situation? What would she be doing there? Of course, the Jews should not have been in Mesopotamia in the first place, should they? As far as that's concerned, this is an emergency story. They should all have gone home to Palestine and got into some of the difficult experiences there, described in Ezra, and Nehemiah, and Haggai, and Zechariah. Well, it took the king about 4 years of intensive research and investigation to choose his number one wife, and it turned out to be Esther. And then you remember the intrigue, and you remember the death decree that was passed, how the lots were cast to decide the day on which the people could be killed. And the Hebrew for Lot is what gives that day its name, and the feast that celebrates it, the Feast of Purim, the Feast of Lots, because the lot was cast to determine the day of execution. And then you remember how the people were given permission to defend themselves, and they defended themselves with considerable vigor, didn't they? And killed thousands of people, and so the story ends. Why put a story like that in the canon? If you have the Jerusalem Bible, or the New American Bible, or the Confraternity Bible, or if you have certain Protestant versions with the Apocrypha in the middle, you have another story somewhat like it, the book of Judith. Anybody have the book of Judith tonight? That tells how during one of the sieges of Nebuchadnezzar, Holofernes, the general, was camped outside Jerusalem with his armies, and Judith risked her life to go out and make contact with the king, and he decided that she was very nice, and he kept her overnight. Later on during the night, she killed him, and it resulted in the army being driven off. It's a story of a heroine who risked her life. Why do we leave Judith out and put Esther in? Well, what did you decide on the book of Esther? How many key texts in that book? There's one at least, isn't there? Who knows but what you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Well, would you want your daughters to wind up in an Oriental potentate's harem? Would you want that?
I don't think that she entered the beauty contest. He sent out his eunuchs to find good-looking girls. They didn't enter voluntarily in the first place.
You think she was conscripted against her will?
I think she was conscripted, whether it was against her will or not. That we have no way of knowing.
You don't think that she should have said, I absolutely cannot do this. Over my dead body, I won't go.
It probably would have been over her dead body.
Yes, it probably would. She wound up there anyway, whatever the method was. She wound up there. And God doesn't comment on it. He doesn't say whether it was good or whether it was bad. Have you noticed that with so many stories? Things happen and God doesn't comment on it. He just works through that difficult situation. And whether it was good or bad, he turned it around and certainly made a blessing out of the situation. And you'd have to admire Esther's courage under the circumstances. She risked her life too. And also she was very tactful, very winsome. In fact, one reason for the inclusion of the book, it's thought by some, this gives us a little insight into how the king was prepared a little later to regard Israel so favorably, and under Ezra encouraged the rebuilding of the city later on, some years later. Esther may have been influential in that. Any other reason for the book being in there? I mean, it's not exactly a model, is it? Because number one, remember, they should not have been there in the first place. That's important to remember. It is an emergency situation, and the emergency becomes acute when there's a death decree. Is that part of the reason why it's in there? Does this sound familiar? A death decree to destroy God's people. Now, Haman just didn't like them. But who behind the scenes would be wondering, will the Messiah be born to the refugees who've returned to Palestine? Or will he be born among those who've stayed behind? Several times, the devil has tried to work out when the Messiah was going to be born and tried to eliminate him. What's the first time on record you can think of? When it was time for the exodus from Egypt, wouldn't that be a logical time for the Messiah to be born, to lead them out to freedom? And so there was a death decree to destroy the boys in Egypt. And in a remarkably providential way, Moses was preserved and protected. And he was, in a way, like a Messiah, an anointed one, wasn't he? In fact, later on he said, God will raise up a prophet like me, meek as I am. So in a way he was a little Messiah and he led them out. Then there's this death decree. Was there another time when a death decree, no doubt influenced by the adversary, was passed to destroy the Messiah or to block his coming? Yes, how about under Herod, the death decree in Bethlehem, and all of the boys 2 years old and under were to be killed. And just as Moses was preserved in his day, so Jesus was taken down to Egypt until Herod died, and then he came back. Now the devil has tried to thwart God's purposes, hasn't he, in many ways. What did he do back in Palestine? There was no death decree there, but did he work in every way to thwart the development of the work back in Palestine? He worked through Sanballat, you remember. That's what offended Ezra and Nehemiah so much when they found that the high priest's son had married Sanballat's daughter. Can you imagine? And he drove him from his presence, you remember. Think of making such close alliance with those who were really trying to block up the work. Well, you remember when Balak wanted Israel cursed, and that didn't work. He found a method that would work. And the Midianite women came into the camp and almost succeeded where the curses had failed. Was it not through the influence of the pagan tribes that surrounded Israel that once again the refugees were intermarried and involved in their heathen worship, and it took Haggai and Zechariah and Ezra and Nehemiah to straighten things out? So the devil works also in many and various ways, but he's used the death decree several times. I understand that the book of Esther ranks very high with devout Jews. Because in a way it was a bit like the Exodus, wasn't it? There was a death decree and God's people were delivered and set free. There was another death decree here in the days of Esther, and God worked to deliver his people. So traditionally Esther is highly regarded. Luther didn't like it too well, but the Jews have loved the book of Esther. Now, is there any other reason why the book might be preserved? Does it say much to us? How about the fact that only 50,000 went home? And there were many times 50,000 living back there in Mesopotamia. The 70 years were up that Jeremiah had predicted, and very shortly we'll read the prediction, though we've had several references to it. Wouldn't you think if you were a devout Jew, you'd have on your calendar the 70 years worked out? At least as every year went by after 606, you chalk up another year and another year. And now you're getting old. Maybe you're 80, maybe 90 years old. And you know the 70 years are up. And like Daniel, you're wondering, are we going to go home? Daniel's magnificent on this. And lo, permission comes to go home. What do you say? Well, who wants to go? That's incredible, isn't it? It's like Adventists taking the second coming so coolly. Maybe a little later sometime. It's incredible that so many Jews didn't care to go home. Ellen White's comment in Prophets and Kings 5:98 is, rather than undergo the hardships of the return journey, most of them stayed behind. If you were God, how would you feel about the people who didn't care enough to go home? Well, there was a death decree to destroy them. And God could have said, well, they really have it coming, it seems to me. I'm not going to do anything. Instead, he worked in his usual ways, many and various ways, to save his people. Now, we normally don't understand God this way. At least I grew up being told that if you went somewhere you shouldn't, your guardian angel remained on the sidewalk outside until you came out and he could go on protecting you. Did any of you hear that as children? Does that fit this story? Did God look after those who didn't have enough faith and interest to come home? He looked after them. This is good news. How about the lost sheep? Did the shepherd stay with the 99 or go after the one? And I think we could really misrepresent God to our children. Not that we want to encourage them to feel they can go anywhere they like, they'll always be protected. We shouldn't encourage presumption. And we do have the word that if we really refuse God's protection, it will not be forced upon us. But if it's thoughtless, if it's careless, and that's not good either, but we find ourselves where we should not be, and you wonder if God might still be looking after you, then read the book of Esther instead of listening to stories about angels staying on the sidewalk till you come out. That's not in Scripture. This is, and the lost sheep and other places like it. Now, forbid that we should presume upon that. That's warned against in Romans, isn't it? Do not presume upon God's kindness as if it were weakness on his part. His kindness is meant to lead us to repentance. Have you ever, don't answer this, been somewhere maybe you shouldn't have been and experienced a hazardous moment in that situation? And somehow it seemed that providence had gone out of its way to look after you. And you said, God, I didn't deserve to be protected here. Thank you very much. And that brings repentance. Or anything even close to it. I mean, God looks after his lost sheep. He runs great risks to find and save them. And he looked after the sheep who stayed behind in Mesopotamia. And it seems to me that's great good news. One question many people ask, and not spending too long on Esther as we might, because we do have Job. What about the permission that was given for the Jews to defend themselves? You remember the law of the Medes and Persians cannot be changed. And so the king said, well, all I can do is give them permission to defend themselves. Did you note the wording of the permission? That's in 3:13, Esther 3:13. What were they allowed to do besides kill their enemies? It says, letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to slay, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. You see, that was part of the original permission. And Haman had cast lots to determine that this would be the best day to do it. Now, in response to that, look at 8:11. When the king said, you can defend yourselves, and this can really be tit for tat. Look at 8:11. By these letters, that the couriers took out, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to slay, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, with their children and women, and to plunder their goods. So this was equal, wasn't it? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The Jews did kill a great many people. 500 in one city, 300 and another, 75,000, doesn't it mention, out in the provinces? But did they take any plunder, any booty? They didn't touch it. So it wasn't an ordinary thing they were doing. Do you think it would have been better, though, if in response they had not fought? What's the message here? Does this mean maybe we should defend ourselves? And if there's a danger in the environment around the West Covina Church, on your way out, you should get your gun from the literature department, to defend yourself. What's the lesson here? These things were written for our examples. Now, there's no comment, is there, from heaven whether they should or should not have done this. They did. Now, they didn't plunder. But there's still no comment. I just have to fall back on the fact that they shouldn't have been there in the first place. God never designed that any of them ever fight anyway. The ideal has long been lost, hasn't it? So God is meeting them in a place where they should not have been, under circumstances they should not have experienced. and maybe help them fight which he didn't like. So this shouldn't confuse us as to the ideal. If we read the Bible as a whole, it's clear what the ideal is. And if we have any doubt, wait till Jesus comes and look how he treats people. Of course, when you turn the other cheek in a hard-hearted world, what's likely to happen to the other cheek? It'll get hit. And when you're meek and mild in a world of arrogant, hard-hearted people, are you likely to be treated with respect? No, you'll be despised. And that's what Jesus showed for 3.5 years. And I think that the reaction that he experienced helps us understand why God had to thunder to his people through the years, send she-bears and kill Uzzah, and then Ananias and Sapphira. God hates to do that, the one who sees the little sparrow fall. But had he led out as Jesus did for those 3.5 years, had he led out that way through the centuries, what do you suppose would have been accomplished? So he came, and for 3.5 years he led out the way God likes to run his universe. But that method only works among meek, loving, trustworthy people. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, he got up and said, "Blessed are the meek, who are like me and like Moses, because the earth will be theirs." And because the earth will be inhabited by meek people, then God can lead out in a meek way. But you can only do that with meek people. Now, meekness isn't weakness. When you realize the one who was so meek was the one who could speak and hang a whole vast universe in space, don't call him weak. And when Peter saw them despising him and his prophecies of his coming, he said, "Remember, this is the one who created the world, and this is the one who drowned the world in a flood. And if he says he's coming again and there'll be fire, you'd better believe it." But he doesn't like to talk that way. He'd rather talk softly as he talked to his disciples, even sitting with them at table and washing their dirty feet. So we shouldn't be confused by these emergency situations, should we, as to what the ideal is if we read the Bible as a whole. Now, turning to Job, that's what the other theologians weren't able to do, it would appear.
Just as we should not identify meekness with weakness,
Yes.
wouldn't it be reasonable to say that we should not always identify self-defense with faithlessness?
I didn't know you were going to choose that word. You might have chosen some other one.
I know.
That's interesting to think about. No, I think when God led them into battle, understanding him as they did, which was not as well as it should have been, he said, "Are you with me? I'm going to lead you into battle, and I'm going to help you fight. I want you to fight well. I want you to fight thoroughly." And those who were with him on that level of understanding obeyed him, trusted him, and did what they thought he really wanted them to do. Yeah, so they were faithful, but on that level. And God says, "I wish you were on a higher level," and Jesus came to show what that is. No, you raise a nice point. I think that in all those battles where God directed them, yeah, he helped them fight. He gave them time to fight. He expected them to fight. And when Saul didn't do what God had asked him to do, though God hated his doing it, then you remember Saul was reprimanded.
Is it reasonable to imagine that there may be other situations in the future?
Where God would want us to fight?
In some way?
I don't think he wants us to go back to the foot of Sinai. I don't think he wants us to go back to the wilderness. He's waiting for a group of people who'll be more like Job. I think that's what he's really waiting for. And whose model would be Christ, who turned the other cheek.
Before we leave Esther, I think we should notice that there were 127 provinces,
Yes.
all the way from India to Ethiopia,
Yes.
that was controlled by Ahasuerus,
Enormous.
and that the Jews were scattered through all of them, and that these decrees went to all of them. The Jews were already scattered
Yes.
to all the, what you might call the civilized or
Yes.
uncivilized nations of the world at that time. So they were there for a witness, but what kind of a witness were they? And we think of ourselves as Seventh-day Adventists. We're scattered all over the world now, but what kind of a witness are we?
Now, this raises a significant point, and just before we do Matthew, we ought to talk about what happened between the Testaments. As the Jews were scattered more and more through what's known as the dispersion, the diaspora. It's estimated that when Jesus was here, there were more Jews in Alexandria than in all of Palestine. They'd scattered everywhere. Now, did they take the good news with them? What witness did they bear? Unless we feel smug about it, what about us in our time? We're getting to be a pretty large group in all the countries of the world. How well are we doing? Now, they were known for certain things wherever they went. They were known for certain things about their God, for their scriptures, for the Sabbath, for their tithe paying, for their health habits. That's why it worries me when we go to the world and say, let us tell you about our health habits. I mean, I'm for good health habits. It'd be foolish not to be. But our Latter-day Saint friends are going to the world with their health habits, and they're doing about as well as we are. So we're not gaining with that. The Jews were known for so many things, and they were such a gifted people. But their witness to God was not that good. And that's what I wish we were known for. And God will have a group who will be known for that before the end comes. But now we get into the picture of God and why they had difficulty representing God. For in Job, we have one man who really speaks well of God. The other theologians don't do that well. And what is the difference? Did any of you have time to read Job out loud, as suggested? Sometime you might like to enjoy that, with a group preferably even, taking each of the parts. Who wrote the book of Job? No one knows for sure. A tradition I like very much is that Moses was the author, and Ellen White just states that as an assumed truth. In Signs of the Times, February 19, 1880, she speaks of Moses being the author. Now, one vote in its favor. Wouldn't you agree that Moses knew God extraordinarily well? And he had a most mature relationship with God. And he could stand all alone most of the time. Just near the end, he broke faith with God. But how magnificently Moses spoke well of God. When God said, let me destroy the people, Moses said, no, you couldn't. It would hurt your reputation. So a man like Moses could have done it. Now, if it's true that Moses wrote the book of Job, there's further indication he knew about the great controversy. For here's the conference, the council meeting in heaven, and Satan accusing. And who's defending, by the way? Is someone having to plead with God in Job's behalf? No need at all. As John 16:26 says, there is no need to plead with God in man's behalf, for God loves us as much as the Son does. You don't see people pleading with God in Job's behalf. Job pled in his own behalf, but God was on his side. We know the background. It's Satan who's against us. Who's the accuser of the brethren who accuses us day and night before God? See, Satan accused both God and Job in these first two chapters. Well, Moses, who wrote Genesis, knew about the conflict, didn't he? In order to write the story of the Garden of Eden. But if he wrote Job also, he had considerable insight into this. Moreover, the one who wrote Job had to know God very well. And there's evidence that Moses did, isn't there, in the 5 books. Now, the scene in chapters 1 and 2 is so well known to us. The family of the universe is in session, and Satan came among them. No longer Lucifer, no longer a bearer of light, he's a liar. Satan, the adversary, comes among them. And who introduces the subject of Job? God says, have you considered my servant Job? He's a perfect man. Was God's evaluation of Job in error? As you read on through the book, did you come to the conclusion that Job was in no way perfect to behave like that? How could God call him perfect and upright? I think we ought to take God's evaluation more literally, I think, because right to the very end, he compliments Job. And Satan says, well, does he serve you for naught? You know, that text in Malachi hadn't been written yet, that if you pay your tithe, God will open the windows of heaven and reward you, and that's the reason for paying tithe, you know. How about Mr. Penny and his whole chain of stores? Was he not a tithe payer? We have wonderful stories about those who've been rewarded for paying tithe. Job paid tithe and seemed to get nothing out of it later on, did he? We shouldn't mislead people. You might not get money back. You might just get something else that's hard to measure back. And so God said to Satan, in the hearing of the onlooking universe, who had now heard the accusations against God and his friend, you may do anything you like to this man. You may not touch him. And Satan went off gleefully, because he's quite a legalist, himself. He doesn't understand trust anymore. And you remember what Job passed through. He lost everything, but Satan could not touch him. So at the next meeting of the council, God says, well, how about my servant Job? Seems to me he's doing rather well. And Satan said, well, it's because you won't let me touch him. If I could lay my hands on him, he'd curse you to your face. And God said to the onlooking family of the universe, watch this closely. I'm going to allow Satan to do anything he likes to this man. And I want you to know, I trust him so. Job will not let me down. Now, I'm not going to let Satan take his life, because then the whole demonstration would come to an end. Is there a time you anticipate in the future when God may say, Satan, you can do anything you like to these friends of mine, short of taking their lives, and they will not let me down? They are sealed, we say. That is, they're so settled into the truth, both intellectually and spiritually, that they cannot be moved. It seems to me Job is a sample. He's a type of these mature, grown-up, adult believers in the last days. How would you like to know that God was saying to the heavenly council, I'm going to allow Satan to do anything he likes to this person, naming you by name, and this friend of mine will not let me down? Would you like to know that as of now? Well, if you're going to survive the time of trouble, it will have been said of you and me. This is no bedtime story, is it? This is really for grown-ups. God loves to answer the prayers of children very quickly. My father enjoyed that more. There are more stories on that, aren't there, in the bedtime stories than any other. How God answers the prayers of little children when they need help. How about grown-ups who may be in great need, and they pray for help, and it doesn't seem to come? And they wait, but they still trust God because they've known him to be trustworthy. That's not for children. But that's for Job. That's for grown-ups. That's for the people living in the last days who will seem to be abandoned. Isn't that true, as you understand the closing events? So Job really pertains to our day and is most significant to read. For example, when Job went through such a time of trouble, what caused him the greatest trouble? The loss of his estate? The loss of his family? These were all terrible things. The loss of his health, or the bad theology he was given. It's the agony of answering those theologians. And you see, they were friendly theologians. They loved Job. They came from a long distance. And when they saw him, they were so moved, they sat there for 7 days and 7 nights and couldn't say a word. Their old friend Job in such a predicament. And they knew he not only was sick and had lost everything, but that he had sinned. And so they were so disturbed for Job, because you could only be in such a predicament if you had sinned terribly, according to their theology, which he disagreed with. And so the long dialogue, and finally he gets so distressed, he said, I wish you'd please be quiet. You're misrepresenting the truth, you're misrepresenting me, and you're misrepresenting God. Let me talk to him. If you'd be quiet, I could do it better. You see, not all theology is helpful. And I think in the last days, what will cause the most distress will be perhaps theology given in great concern, and perhaps with great love and all the rest, but it's wrong. Are we so settled into the truth that we could discern when the theological help is wrong and when it's right? This is not for babes in the truth, is it? This is for grown-ups. People who are like Ephesians 4, no longer children easily swayed to and fro by every wind of doctrine, but they've grown up, they're mature, and they speak the truth in love, and as Hebrews 5 says, they have their faculties trained by practice to distinguish good from evil. And the word that's used in Ephesians and Hebrews to describe people who are stable like that is perfect in the King James, mature and grown up in the Greek. And that's the meaning of perfection. We've sometimes made perfection mean something that's out of sight. But to be grown up, is that unreasonable? It's unreasonable not to grow up. When people don't grow up physically, we get worried. When they don't grow up mentally, we get alarmed. But when they don't grow up spiritually, we sometimes say, isn't that precious? They still have the faith of a little child. No, that's retarded. That's spiritually retarded, and we should be very, very alarmed. The only time in your life when it's all right to have the faith of a little child is when you've been freshly reborn, maybe just stepped out of the baptistry, and you need lots of protection then, because you're still a child. Within a few years, Paul wrote to the Hebrews, by now you should be teachers, not students. You should be teaching others, and you still need the ABCs of God's Word. We should come to that later in Ephesians and Hebrews. But we've got Job in the Old Testament as an example of a grown-up person. Could he be swayed easily to and fro? Of course, he suffered a great deal, and that's part of the record. Just quickly, in what other parts of the Bible do you find the heavenly council in session, this conference of God's children? Are there any other places besides Job 1 and 2? That come to mind? Yes, in Revelation, by all means, mention. Are there any other times that come to mind? Yes, in Zechariah, you have Joshua the high priest standing before God and Satan at his right hand accusing him as usual. Any other places where you have the heavenly council together? A time that mentions 100 million in session. How about Daniel 7? See, that's another one of these scenes. What about in Romans 8, it says, if God be for us, as he was for Job, who can be against us? Who could bring any accusation against those whom God has chosen? God says this man is right. Who would dare say that he's wrong in Romans 8? Doesn't it sound like Job? See, God is for us. Which member of the Godhead is for us? If you read in Romans 8, the Father's for us, the Son is for us, and it says in Romans 8, even the Holy Spirit intercedes for us with sighs too deep for words. Then all three members of the Godhead are for us. So it's enough in the Old Testament that God was for Job, and Satan was accusing. Don't have to wait till Revelation 12 for this picture of the accuser. You can use Job 1 and 2, you can use Zechariah 3 as was suggested, use Romans 8, and of course, Revelation 12:10, the accuser of our brethren who before our God accuses us day and night. And he's especially doing it at the present time. So I think Job helps us to view the plan of salvation in the larger setting of the great controversy. Now, Job, after he's lost everything, and some might ask, was it fair for the children? Was this whole thing fair? Anybody want to suggest that the great controversy is fair? I mean, there's no fairness in this thing. This is a serious emergency. And don't try to make any of it fair. But God offers us a way out, and if we wish to join him in the triumph, I don't think in the hereafter we'll complain. I'm sure God would make it up to his children who've gone through this experience and been his friends and spoken well of him. I'm sure God will congratulate Job. He went through a terrible experience. So did Jeremiah. And so did Isaiah. Look at all the others listed in Hebrews 11 who suffered so. And these would be very special people, I should think, in the eyes of the angels as well as of God. But after Job has lost everything, he still doesn't sin with his lips, but he does express his depression, doesn't he? I wish I knew all the versions that you used, and I don't know whether to use Revised Standard tonight or the Good News, today's English, which I recently read Job in again and marked it up. It's so dramatic. Maybe since it's most like our common version, I'll stay with the Revised Standard and look in the other occasionally. What about chapter 3? Right away, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night which said a man-child is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, this is his birthday. We don't do this on birthdays, do we? That night, let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Yea, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry be heard in it, like the cry of a baby, maybe. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are skilled to rouse up Leviathan. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not come forth from the womb and expire? Why do the knees receive me, or why the breasts that I should suck? For then I should have lain down and been quiet. I should have slept. Then I should have been at rest, with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuild ruins for themselves, and so on. Verse 16, why was I not as a hidden, untimely birth, as infants that never see the light? And then 20, why is light given to him that is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not? He wanted to die. Well, how do you think he should have behaved? He's just lost his whole family, and his wife was so sad, she said, why don't you curse God and die? And I once left the slightest impression that maybe Mrs. Job shouldn't have said that, and Elder Huback was nearby, and he's one of the kindest men I know. Oh, he said, sympathize with Job's wife. She couldn't bear to have her husband suffer anymore. And so she made this suggestion. For my sighings come as my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. Look at his feelings. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. See, he's not only lost everything, but he's covered with boils. Do you ever have a boil? I've only had one in my life, and it was in a time of stress. I was typing my PhD dissertation, and I was doing it in 10 nights after teaching all day, and it was one of my earliest experiences on an electric typewriter, one of those first IBMs that was so sensitive, and we were not allowed to make one erasure. We had to turn in these pages absolutely perfect, and I had 350 to go in the 10 nights, starting about 10, 11 at night. And as the tension built up on this thing, I got a boil on the back of my neck, and I thought about poor Job, who had them all over. One's bad enough. How about all over? Now, what do you expect of a man who's lost his whole family, and he's lost his health, he's covered with boils, he's lost his estate, and he's lost the esteem of the whole community? How do you think he ought to behave? He felt so terrible, he did what people did those days. He tore his clothes, put ashes on his head, and he went out and sat on what the King James calls a dung heap or a garbage dump. If you do that, remember Ezra did something similar? We discussed that last week. You might have a pastoral visit there, but I don't think the pastor will just, give you a Bible study and prayer. And he'd suggest, could I take you home? I suggest a bath maybe. Not those days. This is the way you expressed your utter depression. So here's this wonderful friend of God, just about overwhelmed. And he cries out, I wish I'd never been born. And these friends come from a long distance and sit beside him. And they'd never seen him like this. He was one of the leading citizens in the area and so prosperous because he had been so blessed, because he was so good. That's their theology. And then when he curses the day he was born, what do you think of the response of the first of the theologians to speak up? He says, if one ventures a word with you, Brother Job, would you be offended? Yet who can keep from speaking? Behold, you have instructed many, and you have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling in times past, and you've made firm the feeble knees, but now it has come to you, and you're impatient. It touches you and you're dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? Think now, who that was innocent ever perished? Meaning you must be bad. In verse 17, he even says, can mortal man be righteous before God? Can a man be pure before his Maker? Even in his servants God puts no trust. That true? Or his angels he charges with error. You mean God doesn't trust anybody really? Because nobody's that trustworthy? The visitors don't know about chapters 1 and 2, do they? Where God has said, I trust Job. He's a perfect and upright man, and he will not let me down. They couldn't believe that. Well, if God charges his angels with error and does not trust his servants, how much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed before the moth, and so on. And so, this friend goes on to say, obviously, Job, you must have sinned. Why don't you repent, and God will forgive you, and you'll be blessed once again, and if you're blessed, you'll be prosperous, for that was the general understanding. And so the dialogue goes on, and Job disagrees. And the main thing the friends say is, Job, you should be more respectful to God, the almighty, powerful one. You should just bow your head and accept his correction here, his judgment of you, and seek to find what your sin is and admit it and confess it. And Job argued with them. And then God appeared and spoke to him, didn't he? Near the end. And Job says, I repent in dust and ashes. I'll say no more. I'll ask no more questions. And God said, well, apparently then the experience is over, and I will sum up the situation. This may surprise you, you theological friends. You think you did a good job. You were wrong. Job was right. He has said of me what is right. Job, pray for these three. And I wonder if it took him a moment to get his breath after hearing that before he could compose a prayer. I'd love to hear the prayer that Job offered. Thank you, God, for my friends who came all this long way. I'm moved they come and sit. They couldn't even talk, God, for all those days. They really are my friends. But, God, I hope they won't misunderstand when I suggest that maybe they're not as good friends of you as I think I am. As I know you, God, now that you've encouraged me to believe I've said the right thing, you were not offended by my cries. They think you were offended. Now I realize you weren't. I wonder what he said. I'm sure he really called down God's blessing on those friends who came. It was very kind of them to come. They were kindly wrong. That is possible. It's possible even to be very sincerely wrong. It's possible even to be very confidently wrong. But Job, who knew God so well, would be able then to treat these friends who were wrong, I think, in a very generous manner. But I wish that prayer were on record. Now, as you go through this whole book, is it safe to use key texts right out of context? What if it's one of the friends giving some bad theology? Do you want to quote that? So you've got to note carefully who's speaking. What if it's Job speaking? Would everything Job said be pure, distilled theology, and you can quote it just the way it is? How about Job's depression in chapter 3? I mean, that's just the way he felt. And it's on record. In the Psalms next time, we'll have examples of this. Don't quote those verses out of context, and we shouldn't quote verses out of Job without considering the context very, very carefully. In what way were the friends wrong? Their concern was good. They came a long way, but their theology was incorrect, and God said so. That they had not said of God what was right. Whereas Job, who worried the friends by the things he said to God, was right. And in what he said to and about God, he apparently was representing God correctly. Well, where do you think the error was on the part of the three theologian friends that came? I'm calling them theologians because they talked about God so much. That's what theology is all about. I don't mean they came fresh from the local seminary there, but they knew about God as they understood him, and they talked about him to Job.
I'm thinking about the case in John 9 where there's this man that's blind, and so Christ is walking, and his disciples walk by, and the disciples say, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And neither this man nor his parents, said Jesus, but this happened that the work of God might be displayed in his life. And
Yes.
so he heals the man.
Yes.
And then he's a witness to the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin. They want to know, who healed him.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a discourse that reveals about Christ. And
Now, what do you think of this example? See, they thought, according to their theology, that the man was blind because of the sins of his parents, that God was punishing him. There are a number of examples like this. They knew about the blessings and the cursings, you remember, from Deuteronomy. I imagine we talked about this back there. And God, through Moses, spoke simply to the people, if you're good, I'll bless you, and if you're bad, I'll punish you. And if I bless you, I'll prosper you. It even says that God blesses people by making them fat. We would hardly regard that as a blessing now. A little different in those days. To show that in the time of Christ, in addition to the illustration you gave, which I think is a very significant one, see, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? You remember Jesus said it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to be saved. And they said, well, who then can be saved? Meaning, if a rich man cannot be saved, who can be? Well, that seems odd to us when we're told that the love of money is the root of all evil, and the rich probably have extra problems in being saved. You know the background for this. It's Job, and it's the Pentateuch, the way they read it and misread it. You see, if a man was rich, it's because he was blessed. And if he was blessed, it's because he was good. Therefore, if you were rich, you were probably good. So it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to be saved. Well, if rich people can't be saved, how can poor people be saved? Because you're poor, because you're not blessed, and you're not blessed because you're bad. So they knew they could look around the community, and you could tell the people who were good because they were blessed and they were prosperous. But if a man in the community was once very prosperous, and now he's lost his health and his family and his estate, he's lost everything, you know that he's not being blessed, and that he must have sinned very seriously. And so when Jesus got up and said, "Blessed are you poor," they couldn't understand that in the Sermon on the Mount. That made no sense at all, according to this rather arbitrary, legalistic rule they had. And I'm afraid that we perpetuate that in many ways, too, to the present time. That's why it's so significant that Job says the man was perfect. He was not sinning and offending God. He was God's friend. We need chapter 1 and 2 very badly before reading the rest. And all these dreadful things happened to a saint. Would God allow a man to be tested more than he's able to bear? Isn't that one of our key texts? Then God knew that Job could take it. In fact, announced that he could, even announced that he would. And Job was not tested more than he could survive. And Job was complimented. He didn't feel that way then, that's for sure in the record. But in retrospect, he'll realize how he was the subject of discussion before the heavenly council. He won't learn this maybe till the hereafter. He'll come up to God and say, "What was that all about? Tell me." And God could tell him what we got from chapters 1 and 2. Oh, he'd say, "I really was honored, wasn't I? I didn't feel honored. I felt terrible. You mean I said of you what is right? All those things I said? Oh, I said many things beyond my understanding." Isn't that in the last chapter? I said many things beyond my understanding. God said, "That's all right. Every preacher does." You know, anytime anybody gets up in this pulpit, in this lovely church, it's never good enough, is it? It never can be. But God's very generous. If wholeheartedly we've tried to tell the truth about him and show the evidence for it from Scripture, God says, that's very well done. I mean, the grammar may have not been too good, and the voice wasn't too good, and he has funny little mannerisms, and he could have used some other very good text, but he didn't. Fortunately, the God who said to Solomon, your father, he followed me with all his heart, is very generous to preachers, I hope, Well, Job didn't necessarily do the best job, did he? He was a little worried in the end. He said, God, I remember all the things I've said. I said a lot. I'm afraid I said some things beyond my understanding. God said, never mind. We were very proud of you up here. You said of me what is right. Generous as always. Well, much of what the friend said is true, isn't it? Wouldn't you agree with many of the verses? We often pluck them out as fine key texts about God being the creator and so on. They said a lot of good things. Then where was the error? Well, is it not in their shocked reaction to Job's depression and his cries and his complaints that God wouldn't talk to him the way he used to? Look at another spot in here, chapter 10, 10:1. And the friends are still listening to this suffering saint. In 10:1, he says, I loathe my life. I will give free utterance to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why thou dost contend against me. He didn't know chapters 1 and 2, did he? It just looked so unfavorable and so forbidding. Does it seem good to thee, God, to oppress, to despise the work of thy hands and favor the designs of the wicked? Hast thou eyes of flesh? Dost thou see as man sees? Are thy days as the days of man, or thy years as man's years, that thou dost seek out my iniquity and search for my sin, although thou knowest that I am not guilty? How about that? I'm not guilty. Doesn't he elsewhere mention the sins of his youth? He's not saying I'm a perfect man. He's saying I'm not guilty of what these men are saying I'm guilty of. I do trust you, and I do acknowledge your power. He said it over and over. He said, I agree with you, men. You're not telling me anything I don't know. He said that several times, didn't he? All you're telling me is how powerful God is. I know he's powerful. So does the devil. We all agree on that. I just want to know why God won't talk to me. He was always such a friend of mine. We talked all the time, and he's not talking to me now. And you're talking so much I couldn't hear him if he were. I wish you'd please be quiet. You remember? Well, how calm do you want him to be on the dung heap? I mean, do you think it would be right for Job to say, well, so I lost all my children, and I lost my estate, and I lost my health, and I've lost all my friends in the community, and I'm sitting here on the dung heap, but it really doesn't bother me very much. You know, if you have faith, these things don't bother you. When Jesus was tormented by people behaving as beasts, did it bother him? Ellen White says it was agony for him. The people he had come to save behaving like beasts, and to the extent that he was more sensitive and intelligent, as many of us, he suffered the more. It didn't roll off his back like water off a duck's back. It hurt him to see these people behaving that way. In fact, he suffered so it broke his heart in the end, didn't it? That's how much the Lord suffered. How do you think Job should have suffered? Make nice, fine, calm speeches, 3 parts with an illustration in each, and, nice sermons. He's in agony, and he's crying out because he really is upset that God won't talk to him. Was God offended by that, or did he take it as a compliment? Dost thou not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? Look at verse 18. Why didst thou bring me forth from the womb, he says again. Would that I had died before any eye had seen me, and were as though I had not been. That's a phrase we use as Adventists, isn't it? Some people will be as though they had not been. There's a verse. Carried from the womb to the grave. I'd like to have been carried straight from the womb to the tomb. Are not the days of my life few? Let me alone, that I may find a little comfort here on the dung heap, before I go whence I shall not return, to the land of gloom and deep darkness, the land of gloom and chaos, where light is as darkness. Hey, where is that? Was he giving the best theological explanation of what happens when you die? Not pure, was it? He says, I'll never come back. We do come back, don't we? This is just utter depression here at this time. And how this disturbed his friends. They were stunned by Job's boldness. What if they'd heard Abraham say, Should not the judge of all the earth do what is right? What do you think those three men would have said? Oh, Abraham, duck behind a tree. You can't talk to God like that. What would they have said to Moses when Moses said, God, you cannot destroy the people. It would ruin your reputation before the Egyptians and the heathen. They said, Moses, you can't talk to God like that. If God says step out of the way, you better step out of the way. If he's going to destroy the people, you better let him do it. If God has said it, you better believe it. And that's all there's to it. That's the way they lived with God as they knew him. Abraham and Moses reasoned with God with reverence. And God said, you're my friends. Job was behaving like Moses and Abraham as he went through his terrible experience. And he was showing himself really to be a friend. And when God didn't seem friendly, then that upset Job in proportion to the meaning of that friendship. And it meant so much to Job that when it seemed to be broken, he was that much upset. Had they not been close friends, God's not speaking wouldn't have meant so much. Just passed in the night, so he didn't call again. Well, so. But if it's someone you've known and loved for years and years, and is not talking to you, for some reason you do not know, we do from chapters 1 and 2. If you really love that person, would you get upset? And would getting upset be a compliment to that person and mean that your friendship had meant that much, that when it appeared to be broken, you were immensely upset? And as I understand it, God took this as a compliment. The three friends said, you can't talk to God like that. You just can't do that. But that's knowing God in a different way. Look at 11, verse 1. Zophar, the Naamathite, answered, should a multitude of words, Job, go unanswered, and a man full of talk be vindicated? Should your babble silence men? Notice he calls it babble. God says, you're saying of me what is right. The theologian said, that's babble. You ever had that said of one of your precious theological convictions, and to other people it's nonsense? Well, don't be worried by that. Job heard that. And when you mock, shall no one shame you? For you say, my doctrine is pure, and I'm clean in God's eyes. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, Job, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for he is manifold in understanding. Know then that God exacts of you, Job, less than your guilt deserves. You should be sicker, and you should be hurting worse than you are. Think of saying that to Job. You're really getting off lightly, Job. What did they think he must have done to deserve all of this? Can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? It is higher than heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Say, we use that as a key text, don't we? Note, this is a man who didn't think Job was doing very well, who spoke that key text. But still, no matter who said it, if it's true, isn't it? They said a lot of things that are true. Then look at 13. This friend says to Job, if you set your heart aright, you will stretch out your hands toward God. If iniquity is in your hand, put it far away, and let not wickedness dwell in your tents. Surely then you will lift up your face without blemish, you will be secure, and will not fear. If you've done anything wrong, confess it. Come clean, Job. And let's get this settled. We wish you well. We just wish you'd do what you ought to do when you've sinned so badly. Repent, confess, make restitution, and God will forgive you, and then he'll bless you, and you'll be prosperous once again. That's how simply they had worked it out. So Job replies in 12, no doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. Have you ever used that in life? Ever said that to anybody? But I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Who does not know such things as these you've been telling me? I'm not disagreeing with you about God's power and that sinners should confess and be humble. But I'm a laughingstock to my friends. I who called upon God and he used to answer me. I loved it those days. A just and blameless man. I am a laughingstock. In the thought of one who is at ease, there is contempt for misfortune. It is ready for those whose feet slip, and so on. Then go to verse 13 in chapter 12. With God are wisdom and might, I agree with you. He has counsel and understanding. If he tears down, none can rebuild. If he shuts a man in, none can open. I agree with you, my friends. If he withholds the waters, they dry up. If he sends them out, they overwhelm the land. With him are strength and wisdom. The deceived and the deceiver are his. And he goes on like this. Why did they go on arguing with him about God's power and wisdom? Job says, I agree with you. I agree with you. Don't go over that one more time. I agree with you that God is infinite in majesty and power. And don't talk to me as if I didn't believe it. I believe it as much as you do. But you're not discussing my problem. And you don't think God is the kind of person I think he is. I disagree with you about God. So now look at 13:1. Lo, my eye has seen all this, my ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you. He said that twice. But I would speak to the Almighty. That's what I want to do. And I desire to argue my case with God. As for you, you whitewash with lies, worthless physicians are you all. How about that? I mean, they weren't helping him feel better, were they? They were making him feel worse. Oh, that you would keep silent, and it would be your wisdom. You remember, we're coming up shortly to Proverbs, where Solomon says, if you keep your mouth shut, you may be taken to be very wise. If you open it, then they'll know you're a fool. So if you are a fool, keep your mouth shut, and they may think you're wise. He said, if you just keep quiet, it would be your wisdom. Hear now my reasoning, and listen to the pleadings of my lips. Will you speak falsely for God, and speak deceitfully for him? Will you show partiality toward him? These are interesting words. Will you plead the case for God? Will it be well with you when he searches you out? Or can you deceive him as one deceives a man? He will surely rebuke you if in secret you show partiality. Will not his majesty terrify you, and the dread of him fall upon you as you wanted to fall upon me? Your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. I mean, they're getting pretty involved in the argument, aren't they here? Did God later on correct them and rebuke them? Yes, he did in chapter 42. Let me have silence, and I will speak. I will take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in my hand. Behold, now what do you have in your version for this famous verse? King James, is it? Though he slay me, yet will I fear him. Now, in the Revised Standard I have, behold, he will slay me, I have no hope. Do many of you have that? Okay, many versions read that way. It's that there's a question here about the translation. In the Masoretic translation, that is, that there is a Jewish translation into English of the Masoretic, that's the most traditional, authentic Hebrew text. It has, though he slay me, yet will I trust him, in the one that I have. Well, supposing the Hebrew should lean more toward, behold, he will slay me, I have no hope. Read on. Yet I will defend my ways to his face because I trust him, and I know he'll let me talk to him. So I believe they come out the same. This will be my salvation, and so on. Listen carefully to my words, and let my declaration be in your ears. Behold, I have prepared my case. I know that I shall be vindicated. Who is there that will contend with me? For then I would be silent and die. Only grant two things to me, then I will not hide myself from thy face. Withdraw thy hand far from me, and let not dread of thee terrify me. Then call, and I will answer. Does he want to get away from God? Not once in the whole book. He wants to get back in connection with God. And God isn't answering the telephone. And it's distressing Job terribly. He'd like to talk to God about what happened to his children. Remember how he offered sacrifice in case they might have sinned? I mean, he really loved and looked after his children, and he lost them. He'd like to talk about all the verses that if you're faithful with your tithe, you know, the locusts will go through your neighbor's field, but not yours. They went right through his. He lost everything. God, I have a lot to talk to you about. And I'm confident if I could, we could work this all out. It would make sense, as Abraham said on the way to sacrifice his son. God, I can't make sense of this at the moment, but you've always made sense before, so I'm on my way. Surely someday you'll explain, and I don't know why this is happening or why you've asked me to do this or what the solution will be. I can think of some things. Maybe you'll provide a substitute. Maybe you'll resurrect my son. Though I go through and slay my son, I still trust you, Abraham said. See, this is another friend of God. Moses, Abraham, Job, they could talk like this. This is really for grown-ups, though. So he was not afraid for God to call, even though in the end when God called, he bowed his head. He said, oh God, now that I sense your presence, I look back over what I've said. I'm sorry. I'm sure I said many things I shouldn't have. And God says, no, we didn't ask you up in heaven to say it any better than you did. We're more sympathetic up here than your fellow humans down there. In your heart, you were right. And we interpreted everything you said as being in harmony with the truth. So he says, call God, and I'll answer. Let me speak, and do thou reply to me. Dear God, how many are my iniquities and my sins? Make me know my transgression and my sin. Tell me what it is. Now, anything wrong with that? Why dost thou hide thy face and count me as thy enemy? He didn't know about the first 2 chapters, did he? He said, God, maybe I have done something. Something's come between us, and I don't know what it is. Wilt thou frighten a driven leaf and pursue dry chaff? For thou writest bitter things against me, and so on. Well, in chapter 15, Eliphaz speaks up and says, should a wise man answer with windy knowledge and fill himself with the east wind? You remember? Didn't Job reply, your bellies are full of the east wind? I mean, they were getting a little stirred here. Should he argue in unprofitable talk or in words with which he can do no good? But you are doing away with the reverence of God. Was he? See, they thought it was irreverent. God says, that man really reveres me. That's why he's so upset I'm not talking to him. You are doing away with the reverence of God and hindering meditation before God. For your iniquity teaches your mouth, and you choose the tongue of the crafty. See, they really believed Job's theology was wrong. Meanwhile, God is saying, pretty soon I'm going to tell this man how right he is and how wrong they are. Have you listened in the counsel of God? It's too bad those friends hadn't been able to listen in the counsel of God. They'd have heard God saying, this man is perfect, and I trust him, and he won't let me down. They're saying, you should be listening in the counsel of God. Too bad they couldn't hear. They wouldn't have said this, would they? And do you limit wisdom to yourself? What do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that is not clear to us? There's an answer to that. They didn't know God, and he did. Both the gray-haired and the aged are among us, older than your father. Isn't that the argument so often? Ellen White comments on that argument. People who've been in the way a long, long time. And they'll say, never mind all the evidence you've presented. My experience tells me I'm right and you're wrong. Have you read her quotation? And so they're saying, look, we've got the elderly here, the aged and the gray-haired. Being old doesn't make you right. Are the consolations of God too small for you, or the words that deal gently with you? Why does your heart carry you away, Job, and why do your eyes flash? I guess he was pretty spirited in his response, sick as he was, that you turn your spirit against God. Against God? God said he's not against him. And let such words go out of your mouth. What is man that he can be clean, or he that is born of a woman that he can be righteous? Behold, God puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not clean in his sight. What did they mean by that? And God had said to the holy ones, look at Job, I trust him. See, they didn't believe these wonderful things. How much less one who is abominable and corrupt, a man who drinks iniquity like water. And so on down. Said with feeling, how dare you take the position you are, Job? Well, Job goes on and says how much he longs for the old days, when he was at peace with God and with the community. And didn't you like chapters 29 and 30 through there, as he reminisces about it? When the friendship of God was upon my tent, he loved it. And it didn't seem to be there now. And it's true. Hadn't God made that arrangement with the adversary that the devil could make it appear that everything had turned against Job, including God himself? When the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were about me, when my steps were washed with milk and the rock poured out for me streams of oil, when I went out to the gate of the city, when I prepared my seat in the square, the young men saw me and withdrew in respect, and the aged even rose and stood. The princes even refrained from talking and laid their hand on their mouth. The voice of the nobles was hushed, and their tongue cleaved to the roof of their mouth. This man was very greatly respected, but not anymore. When the ear heard, it called me blessed, and when the eye saw, it approved, because I delivered the poor who cried, and the fatherless who had none to help him. I enjoyed doing that. The blessing of him who was about to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. That's the kind of man he was. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. He helped ladies across busy streets like a good scout here. He said, I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the poor, and I searched out the cause of him whom I didn't even know. I broke the fangs of the unrighteous and made him drop his prey from his teeth. Then I thought, I shall die in my nest at home with my family around me, and I shall multiply my days as the sand, my roots spread out to the waters, with the dew all night on my branches, my glory fresh with me, and my bow ever new in my hand. That's what he'd look forward to. Oh, and I can't help mentioning something. Just within the last 2 weeks, a medical student, a girl at Loma Linda, learned that she has an inoperable brain tumor. And she's married. She's a wonderful person. So is her husband. And the family all gathered from around the country, and I had the privilege of meeting with them for prayer. And the family members prayed, and the husband prayed. That's the most moving thing I ever heard, until she prayed too. And the husband said, Lord, you know how much I wanted to grow old with my wife. I really look forward to it. And it looks as if she won't live much longer. Oh, it's just really an experience to listen to that. Well, Job says, I wanted to grow old at home and die there even, with my children around me. And they're all dead. Things have not worked out as I expected. You notice all the things he mentions all the way through there? Suggesting, I've really tried not to do those things. I've really tried to be a good person. Let the Almighty answer me. I want to talk this over with him. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. What is the charge? What have I done that is so evil as to bring all this upon me and my family? What have I done? Well, go back to 23. This is what Job really wanted. Oh, that I knew where I might find him. We sing this, don't we? That's a marvelous song. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat, into his presence. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would. I might even do what Abraham did and said, shouldn't the judge of all the earth do what is right? But he said very reverently and very humbly, I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, he would give heed to me. How about that for a picture of God? He even knows about the still small voice. There an upright man could reason with God, and I should be acquitted forever by my judge. What do you think of that? Behold, I go forward, but he's not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On the left hand I seek him, but I cannot behold him. I turn to the right hand, but I cannot see him. But he knows the way that I take. When he's tried me, I shall come forth as gold. My foot has held fast to his steps. I've kept his way and have not turned aside. I've not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured in my bosom the words of his mouth. But he is unchangeable, and who can turn him? What he desires, that he does. For he will complete what he appoints for me, and many such things are in his mind. Therefore I am terrified at his presence when I consider I am in dread of him. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me, sitting here on the dung heap. For I'm hemmed in by darkness, and thick darkness covers my face. And then God speaks in chapter 38. And the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And they've all been waiting to see if God might say something. How is God going to approach this situation? And he said to Job, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" Isn't that our text, that the universe was looking on creation week? It pops up in places like this. And God goes on like this to speak of his power and all that he's done. Did Job disagree with that? Or has he always agreed with that? So go over clear to 40. The Lord said to Job, "Shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it." And that was all Job could take. Is it possible that for a moment Job came to the conclusion that the three friends were right, that he should not have been questioning God? He should not have been talking the way he was. Because God does appear in his power, and he repeats the sorts of things that the theologians have been saying. Where were you? I am the creator. I'm the powerful one. How dare you discuss these matters with me? And so Job says, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer thee? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. I'm through. I don't have another word to say." Now, what were his feelings at the time? And why was God approaching him like this? For God says, no, don't give up yet. God answered Job out of the whirlwind, "Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you declare to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his?" And he goes on to speak of his power again. And Job has never denied his power, has he? Once in the book. And so we come finally to chapter 42, at the very end. And Job does speak up because God has encouraged him to, though he doesn't want to argue anymore. He says, I'm through. I'll accept it. I guess my friends were right. I shouldn't have done what I did. I know that thou canst do all things, and that no purpose of thine can be thwarted. Quotes, "Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge?" The punctuation is important there. Is Job saying that, or is he recalling the fact that God said it a little earlier? See, hadn't God said to Job, "Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge?" So I think it should be in quotes. And then Job replies, I guess I'm the one. "Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know." Quotes, "Hear and I will speak. I will question you and you declare to me." God had said that, hadn't he, a little earlier? All right, Job says, let me respond to that. "I had heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees thee, and lo, you seem to be just what my friends have suggested. Therefore I despise myself, and I repent in dust and ashes." I shouldn't have done what I did. And some people stop the book right there. That's the end. He repented, and he should have. That's not the end. The punchline is right following, isn't it? After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, who's ready to accept his medals and his commendations, my wrath is kindled against you and against your 2 friends. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. And they must have gone into a state of shock. And I suspect Job went into a state of shock too. What has happened here? This is incredible. Now, therefore, take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you. For I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly. You mean all those marvelous speeches we made were foolish? Yes, they were. You were wrong. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. That's stunning. Should never quit before you come to that paragraph. Now, how do you put it all together, do you think? I think the book contributes so much. The picture of heaven, the discussion with his children, God always. It's an open government up there. And Satan came and accused Job, and God defended him. And this was a marvelous opportunity. God hasn't had many friends like this. In Moses he had one, and Abraham. And they were accused before God in the heavenly council. And with what pride God spoke of Abraham when he showed his trust, and Moses also. Now Job, another chance. And God says, in the hearing of our future neighbors and friends, I have a man here who will never let me down, no matter what. And to make a point, because the devil says, I bought this man off, I bribed him. I say he trusts me for the reason I hope you angels all do, because you found me to be trustworthy. And he made the prediction that Job would not let him down. That has enough to justify the book. But then when Satan brought the time of trouble, and it truly was the time of Jacob's trouble, wasn't it? An indescribably terrible time of trouble, in which you not only have the physical trouble and the loneliness and all the rest of it, but you have theological error, which we're going to have in the last days, maybe having bits of it now, I wonder. I'm sure it'll get worse before the end comes. And many will be confused. False Christs will arise, false prophets. There'll be false spirits. Remember all the warnings. And Job went through that in his day, and he did not let God down. But in the experience, he suffered, and he let God know he was suffering. How about the Psalms? The Psalms say you may do that. If you're depressed, you can say what the psalmist did in the 77th Psalm. If you soak your bed with your tears at night because God isn't talking to you, you can say so. You can put it in a prayer. You can write it in a book in the Bible. That God invites us to express our feelings. And God says, I'm not offended by your crying like this. Evidently, we really were friends. If we were only casual acquaintances, it wouldn't upset you that I'm not talking to you. But we had talked together so many years, the way Abraham and I talked, and Moses and I talked, that this period when I have not talked, you have been in a terrible state of distress. Thank you, Job. I am deeply complimented. It's just the other way around. But you see, many people who don't know God and worship him and obey him from fear wouldn't dare talk to God like this. And thus they deprive themselves of the freedom of talking to him, expressing one's mind as the psalmists do under inspiration. Job would never have dared do what he did unless he'd known God very well, because he acknowledged his power. And if he thought God was a fearsome deity, he wouldn't have dared say what he did. He really did know God. He said, if I could only get in touch with God and we could talk it over, I know God could make sense out of this thing. I know he would. I don't know whether he knows what was written in the last chapter. So, he has to wait for the hereafter. And I could imagine him arising from his grave, and I should think the first thing he'd want to know is, what was all that about? And he'd go to the Lord, and the Lord will say, well, we were having a discussion up here about you. And when Job hears the whole story that we've just reread, do you think he'd be offended? A student one day said, I don't like the way God uses people like pawns in a chess game. And another student answered up and said, well, if God can use me as a pawn to checkmate the devil, I'd feel very honored. I thought that was a very clever answer. I'll not forget that one in a hurry. You see, then you're honored. Poor Jeremiah, look what he went through, and Ezekiel and some of the others. But they were honored. And if we can survive the time of trouble and bear a true and persuasive witness to the truth about our God under such difficult circumstances, then we would hear the same words. And that would be a remarkable time. The last several years, many years now, since the book of Job impressed me so much, I've often repeated, maybe too many times in your hearing, that I cannot conceive of a greater compliment or a more moving moment than to meet God in the hereafter and have him say, "Thank you, you said of me what is right." Surely we desire that as individuals and as a church. But unless we're talking about him, we're not going to get that compliment. And so when the day comes that, like Job, we really concentrate on the truth about God and picture him as he really is, we'll be in a position to hear this compliment. We might even finish the work, because I understand the work to be bearing witness to the truth about our God. Well, that's best served by going through the Bible book by book, I believe. So we have the evidence upon which to base our position. Job is thought to be a difficult book. I think it's a magnificent book when you read it as a whole. What do you think of it? Well, should we pray before we go? Father in heaven, surely we should covet as the greatest of all compliments and commendations these words about Job, that he had said of thee what is right. Forbid that we should make the mistake of the friends, and indeed be zealous and industrious and concerned and eager to help and make our visits, and yet not know thee well enough to represent thee as thou truly art. But how could we know thee without reading the evidence that is recorded in thy word? So we thank thee for the chance we have, for the promise of thy gracious teaching spirit to guide us into the truth. And the truth we desire the most is the truth that Job had and thy other friends in Scripture, the truth about thyself, that yes, indeed, thou art infinitely powerful and majestic, but thou art equally gracious, and how thou art willing to approach thy children. What greater evidence could there be that God, the Creator, should come in human form and sit with people, eat supper with them, wash their feet, so they see no reason to be afraid, and talk with us, and tell us that the Father is just like him. We thank thee for this truth and pray we may represent it aright as Job did. In Jesus'